Greetings guys and gals, my name is Thad and today I want to show you how to checkmate your opponent if you only have a king and a rook. So let's just go. So there are basically two ways a checkmate can be achieved. One of them is with the king on the side of the chessboard and the other one is with the enemy king in the corner of the chessboard. I'm just going to cover both of them so you can see how to make do if you end up in one of these two situations. So the first thing that you want to do is to restrict this king's movement. So right now, you know, the enemy king has basically everywhere to go, and first of all we avoid that by playing h4. Now h4 already restricts the king from going over this line, so he can't move in this portion of the board. So he can only move back or to the side, and you know, if you get lucky, you will have a very aggressive enemy who wants to attack the rook. But if they are more experienced, they will just ignore that rook and, you know, move to the other side. So let's just say c5. And already it is very important that you bring the king into the game. And you want to bring your king as close to the enemy as possible. So we have d2. After that, let's just say the king goes back to d5. You know, the king will always try to stay in the center because he knows, okay, mating is only possible on the edge or the corners of the board. So he just try to stay in the center, but that allows our king to get closer to the enemy king with d3, our king marching into the center of the board. Now the black king still only has the sides and the back to go, and as I've said before, he'll probably try to stick to the center, so he just goes back to e5, and after e5 we basically restrict his movement even more with playing something like rook to d4, and rook to d4 basically creates this wall. The king can't go here, he can't go here, so he basically just has these three squares to go, with every single one pushing him more back, but it already doesn't really matter. So let's just say f5, and you make the square in which he can move even smaller by playing e4. Of course the rook cannot be taken as your king is protecting it, and the black king of course now has an even smaller square to move, so he has to move back again, let's say to f5, and from now on you only need to be very careful that the king protects this rook. And now you just bring your king closer to the enemy king with e3. He goes back to f5, maybe thinking, okay, I can take this rook someday, but you will never let him. You can play king f3, and he has to move now, so let's say he goes back to f6, and you make the square even smaller with f4. So it is very important that your king stays very close to the enemy king and always protects your rook, so he can never approach this rook. So the enemy king can never take this rook. Now the enemy king can't go on this line, he can't go here, he can't go there, so he has to move back again. Let's say f6, and again you make the square even smaller with e5. Now the king only has like these few squares to move in, because of course he can't get out of here. But let's just say he attacks your rook, goes back to f5, and then you can play just king to e4, and he has to go back once more. Let's say g7, you make this square even smaller with f5, and now the king only has a very limited amount of squares to move in. So let's say he's still struggling and does not want to get to the edge or the corner of the board, so let's say he plays g6, and again you can just move your king to f4, protecting the rook. The black king just has to go back, so let's say g7, and again you can just move your king to g5. It is very important to keep these kings close, as the king is what prevents black from ever approaching this rook. So again the black king has to go back to either the edge of the board or the corner of the board, and let's just say, okay, he's going to the edge of the board. Then you're going to play g6, he has to play g8, and this is the position where you have to be really careful, because it is very easy to get a draw here. But basically what you have to do is to waste a move. So let's just say rook to f1, so the king can't go there, so he just has to go back to h8, and after h8 you're just going to play rook to f8, and this is of course checkmate, as the king cannot go anywhere. This is the first checkmate situation where you just checkmate him in a corner. Basically, even though I'm very sure I haven't played the best moves here, it's just very important to remember to first restrict the king's movement with the rook, then get your king close to your rook so the king can always protect the rook, and then just basically take more and more squares away from the king, so he has to move back into a corner where you can then easily checkmate him. And let's just show the second option where the king is checkmated on the edge of the board. So our rook is already controlling the e-file, so this king already has only half the board to move, and we can easily move in with our king with something like king d2, and of course this king is trying his best to stay in the center, so king d4, and after king d4 we can immediately just start to bring our rook into the game and to restrict his movement. So rook e3, and already this king can only move back. King c3, and after king c3 we just play rook d3, of course just utilizing what we've just learned, that you can easily restrict the king even further. The king can only move back, so let's say king c5, and now we just bring our king closer with king c3. Of course this king has to move back once again, and after king c6 we just try to keep our kings close with king c4. This king has to go back again, as remember he cannot move on the d file, so let's say king c7, and that of course is absolutely no problem because we just follow him with king c5. He has to move back again, so let's say king c8. This is of course very easy, so let's get back to this position. So we have c7, you just play king c5. So one last time our king is just following with king to c6, and with king to c6 the black king is actually very limited in his options, because now our king is blocking these 3 squares. He can't go to d8 as the rook is still eyeing that square, so he has to move. And after king b8 again you basically just force him to repeat the move with rook to a3. After rook to a3, remember the king cannot go here because our king is blocking this. He can't go here because now the rook is blocking this square, so he has to move back. And this is the position that is most important if the enemy king has moved to the edge of the board, because basically these 3 squares are blocked, and then you just move the rook on the same line as the king with rook to e8, and of course this is checkmate, as the king cannot approach the rook. He can't go here because of course also of the rook, and he can't go here because the king is blocking these 3 squares. So this is the most important position in this scenario. The kings just standing opposite of each other with 1 square in between them, and then you just have to find this rook move on the same file of the king, and it will be checkmate. This mate can of course occur on every square on the edge of the board, as long as your king is opposite to the enemy's king, and then again just move the rook to the edge of the board. So I would say that there are 3 principal rules of how to checkmate with your king and rook. The first one is try to restrict the enemy king's movement as much as possible. The second one is don't forget to bring your king into the game, as the king is very integral not only for protecting your rook but also to take away squares from the black king. And the third and probably most important thing to remember is that you leave 1 square for the enemy king to move to if you're not checking him, because otherwise of course this would be a draw. So this is a very good example of that. If I play something like rook to g7 saying okay I just restrict your movement, then this will be of course a draw, as the enemy king of course has no more squares to move. But let's say I play something different. Let's just say I play f1, just give him a move, and basically the black king can only move to h7, and now we can immediately utilize what we just learned, that if these kings are in this position then we only have to move the rook to the last rank. So we are going to h1, and this will be of course checkmate. Anyway, so those were a few basics on how to checkmate with a king and a rook. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I also hope that I'll see you in the next one. Until then, have a nice day, have a nice night, and of course as always, have a nice time.